Right now, all our code that interacts with the database is in the getProductsAll function. That includes the code that creates the PDO object with the database name and credentials. We don't want to repeat this code in every place that we need to query the database, so let's look at putting it in another include file. Open your text editor to your htdocs directory. We created a temporary file called database.php for demonstration purposes earlier, but that's exactly the kind of file we need to make our database connection code reusable. Let's move this database.php file to our includes directory. In Sublime Text, you move a file by renaming it with a new path. This file should contain code that will be shared. Every time we want to query the database, we'll need to instantiate a PHP data object with the server name and credentials. We'll leave this first block of code that creates the DB variable in this file so that it can be included everywhere we need to run a query. The exact query we'll run will be different each time, so we won't need this second block of code here in this shared file. We've already copied it over to our products.php file, so we can remove it from here. Anytime we need to connect to the database and run a query, we can now include this database.php file. We'll then have a PHP data object connected to the database ready to run the query. Let's head back to our model code in products.php. In our getProductsAll function, we can now replace this duplicate code here with a command to include our database.php file. Remember to use the root path constant for specifying the absolute server path for the include file. In the includes directory, that file is named database.php. Our getProductsAll function will now include the database file to create this DB object, and it then uses that object to query the database. We'll be adding code to query the database in other places going forward, and we'll be able to include this file in those other places to connect the database without duplicating that block of code. There's one last thing I want to mention about reusing code. In your local development environment, your database server and credentials will often be different than they are in your production environment. When you upload your files to your web server, you don't want to change that information in the database.php file every time. That's something you'll be likely to forget to do. We already have a solution in place, our configuration file. Let's add our database credentials as constants there and talk a little bit more about how this solves our problem with multiple environments. In your text editor, open our config.php file. Here we have two constants, one for the base URL of the website and one for the root path on the web server. Let's add some additional constants, one for each piece of information that we need to create a PDO object. First, we'll need the server or host name. In my environment, that's localhost. Then we'll need the name of the database. Next, I'll specify the port. You won't always need the port if MySQL is using the default port in all of your environments. My local environment does not, so I need to specify it. In my production environment, I'm using the default port. For MySQL, that's 3306. I'll add a comment here with that as a reminder. Then we'll need to specify the database user. In my local environment, I'm using the root user, but in a production environment, that's definitely not something you'd want to do. Be sure to check out the Securing and Maintaining a MySQL Database badge in the Database Foundations course for more on that. And finally, we'll need the database password. We can now update our database.php file to use these constants. I'll replace localhost here with a reference to the DB host constant. I'll replace shirts for Mike here with DB name. I'll replace the port number here with DB port. I'll replace root here with DB user. And I'll replace root here with DB pass. Let's take a look in the browser just to make sure that everything is getting included correctly. Everything still looks good. We have successfully moved our database connection code into a database.php include file, and we've moved our database credentials into the config.php file. As I mentioned before, I usually like to make sure that the code fails correctly if something is wrong, so let's go back to our config file and change the DB host constant again. Yes, that looks good. That means the page is using the credentials from the config file, and it fails correctly when it should. Let's change that host value back now. It might seem a little complicated that we're using so many include files. One to define configuration values, one to create a database object, and another to query the database. But it actually makes it all easier to maintain. Our configuration file contains all the values that might be different across environments, URLs, paths, and database connection information. We can have different versions of that file in our different environments, while all the rest of the functional code can be the same. We also have a single file that connects to the database. We'll use that code block every time we run a query, and by having it in an include file, we can avoid duplicating that code. We now have everything we need in place to write our second query and get the shirt details pages working again.